In film, Oscar bait is a pejorative label for movies that feel less like artistic expression and more like calculated products designed to win Best Picture, either in pursuit of prestige or maybe just to generate ticket sales. They're precision engineered to appeal to the older milquetoast taste of Academy voters: period dramas, war epics, tortured artists, biopics. Even their release dates are strategic, usually dropping in December to stay fresh in the mind for February's big night. They're rarely bad films from a technical standpoint, but there's often a sense of pandering, as if they're just trying too hard to be important. And while recent years have done more to highlight films with broader appeal or ones that move beyond those genre cliches, there's still a stigma around movies that seem made for accolades rather than intent. Games have a similar stigma, even if their award show isn't quite as prestigious. Every December, the entire industry gathers for its biggest night, one that breaks down to about 20% awards ceremony, 80% trailers and ads. The Game Awards, or as I like to call them, the Keeleys, have been running since 2014, meaning we now have over a decade of data to sift through. 11 years of what Game of the Year looks like, and maybe what it takes to win one. For about 8 of those 11 years, I've been quietly keeping a spreadsheet of every nominee and winner. It was made to track predictions between friends, but over time I realised it was a data treasure trove. You can actually see the trends that define what makes a prestige game in the eyes of the industry, and which developers, consoles and genres tend to take home the most awards. If you clicked on this video, you probably already have a mental image of what a Keeley-bait game of the past decade looks like, and unsurprisingly, the data backs it up. As well as being highly rated on Metacritic and OpenCritic, nearly all of them are single-player, action-adventure titles, often published by Sony or released primarily on PlayStation consoles. 6 of the winners carry a PEGI 18 rating for graphic violence and strong language, and most aim for a mature tone, games that try and elevate the usual power fantasy into something more grounded and gritty. Perhaps the most emblematic Keeley-bait game then is Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2, released in 2020. It doesn't just tick all the boxes, its predecessor practically invented them back in 2013. A more mature take on third-person shooting, an epic single-player campaign, and the now standard sad dad protagonist that has been endlessly replicated by games chasing its success. As a result, The Last of Us Part 2 is the closest thing the Game Awards has ever had to James Cameron's Titanic. Nominated for 11 awards and winning 7, the most of any game in the show's history. It almost feels like it was engineered to sweep the ceremony. Funnily enough, Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 might be David Lynch's The Elephant Man of games, nominated for 8 awards in 2023 and winning none. Turns out, having all the same prerequisites as The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't guarantee the same success. Despite their prestige, these Game of the Year winners aren't especially complex mechanically. Action-adventure is such a broad label it can describe anything from Hollow Knight to Assassin's Creed, yet they all share a common DNA. Character-focused, story-driven experiences where the goal isn't mastery over other players, but overcoming a series of carefully designed challenges. The rest follow similar patterns: action RPGs, platformers, with only a single competitive FPS taking the crown back in 2016. They even tend to look the same. Out of 11 winners, 9 are third-person games, all sharing nearly identical control schemes. Press A or X if you're on the PlayStation, and your character jumps. That's not just a coincidence, it applies to more than half of all Game of the Year nominees. 33 out of 62. It's a shared ludic language that makes these games approachable to a wider audience, but it also highlights how limited our idea of state-of-the-art can really be. It's not a controversial statement to say that The Last of Us Part 2 earned its accolades. It's technically stunning for its hardware, and while it's become divisive in hindsight due to false advertising and muddled storytelling, its unflinchingly bleak tone remains rare in games. It also plays incredibly well, largely because it builds on familiar mechanics to create a focused, cohesive vision of stealth and improvised combat in a decaying world. But those familiar, audience-approved mechanics, paired with its relentless emotional heaviness, makes it feel almost like a parody of a Game of the Year winner. Keeley-bait aligns so closely with Oscar bait because both of them stem from a similar insecurity, the desire to be taken seriously. For games, that means striving to be recognised alongside film and television. As a result, these titles often borrow heavily from those mediums, cutscene heavy, packed with star-studded voice casts, and telling epic stories about morally ambiguous anti-heroes. The difference is that playing them rarely carries that same internal complexity. Instead, you're often just pointing and shooting your way through prestige moments. What's especially interesting is how that relationship runs both ways. Almost every single Game of the Year winner has since been adapted, or at least optioned for film or television. The Last of Us became an HBO series, The Witcher got a Netflix adaptation, The Legend of Zelda is getting a live-action movie, and Baldur's Gate 3, well, that's just D&D already. Many of these adaptations have gone on to receive similar accolades, which suggests that a Game of the Year winner could just as easily be a Best Picture or Best Limited Series contender. What's striking about that is how little of it has to do with what makes games games. There's rarely any focus on competition, exploration, mechanical mastery, or even interactivity. Instead, the winners tend to be recognized for narrative, art direction, score, performance, and sound design, all things that have their own categories at the ceremony. That's a pretty startling realization, and one that sets the Game Awards apart from ceremonies like the Seamus McNally Prize or the DICE Awards, both of which have been running longer but rarely get the same spotlight. But what does the rest of the data tell us? Well, when it comes to that Oscar bait window of release, the pattern's actually a little different for games. Tracking the gap between each winner's official release date, not counting early access and the ceremony itself, the average came out to around 200 days. In other words, most winners launched around June or July. That makes sense. Big releases tend to cluster around the year's major breaks and holidays: Easter, summer, Labor Day, Halloween. It also gives plenty of time for these games to be played and soak into the culture. You rarely see nominees drop right before the event, mostly because of the cut-off date. The one big exception, and a fitting one for the show's very first year, was Dragon Age Inquisition in 2014, which was released just 17 days before the ceremony. It still won, and to this day it holds the record for the shortest gap between release and award night. On the flip side, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has the longest gap, releasing just one day after the previous year's ceremony aired. These GOTY nominations are also built by massive teams, with the average headcount rising from around 1,000 to 1,500 over the years. Some outliers are even bigger. Red Dead Redemption 2 credited 4,128 developers, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth listed 3,710, and Marvel Spider-Man 2 had 3,576, according to Moby Games. There's also an expectation that Game of the Year contenders will be built on their own tech. Apart from It Takes Two, developed in the Unreal Engine, just like 124 other nominees across the years, every other winner used proprietary tools developed in-house. That's a sharp contrast to the Indie Game of the Year winners, where 4 of the 11 were built in Unity, 3 in Unreal, 1 in XNA, and another in the Love framework written in Lua. Finally, and perhaps most tellingly, every Game of the Year winner has come from an established developer. Studios that have either won before in a previous category or already carry serious industry pedigree. Very few games from new developers manage to break out of the independent categories, and when they do, they tend to align with the award's prevailing trends: platformers, action-adventures, or roguelikes. I bring this all up because having a high Metacritic or OpenCritic score isn't a guarantee of a nomination, let alone a win. In 2021, for example, the entire Game of the Year category consisted of titles that failed to break above a 90. The actual highest rated game that year was Forza Horizon 5, a PEGI-free multiplayer open-world racing game. By all accounts, it should have been a massive mainstream contender, but it didn't quite fit with the prestige mold. That year's award ultimately went to It Takes Two, the highest rated within its category, and very much the expected third-person narrative-driven action-adventure that tends to define the Keeleys, not just then for its lead designer's famous "fuck the Oscars" outburst. There have been similar snubs over the years. Disco Elysium by Zaum, a top-down RPG dealing with addiction, politics and moral decay, was never nominated despite sweeping every category it was in. Neither was Undertale, Toby Fox's game maker-built RPG inspired by Earthbound and Moon, which couldn't quite find a place alongside less revered nominees like Fallout 4 and Super Mario Maker. I'd also be remiss to not mention Hollow Knight, nominated for Best Debut Indie Game in 2017, only to lose to Cuphead. But there are other factors that influence what breaks into Keeley recognition. Credit to Giovanni Colantonio at Polygon for pointing out that many nomination snubs come down to accessibility and availability, particularly language support. Undertale, for instance, only offers 2 language options, compared to that year's winner, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which has been translated into 17 languages. On average, most Game of the Year winners are available in around 14 major languages, a number that's steadily improved year by year. year. The same even goes for Steam Deck compatibility. For games that are available on that platform, support tends to correlate with wider recognition. This also highlights the limitations within the other categories, particularly when it comes to which independent games actually get recognized. Since 2017, the Best Independent Game Award has been dominated by a familiar handful of publishers: Devolver Digital, Annapurna Interactive, Finji, and Panic. The average team size for these titles hovers around 80 credited contributors, not just the core developers and artists, but translators, QA, and distribution teams as well. And while games like Animal Well and Balatro are often framed as the work of lone creators, the truth is we only know about them because of the extensive support networks behind them. The category also isn't immune to familiarity. 26 nominees out of 55 were built in Unity, a lightweight, accessible engine used by studios of all sizes. The same goes for genre trends. RPGs, roguelikes, and puzzle games dominate year after year. Perhaps the most interesting detail, though, is what isn't familiar. Almost none of these titles came from known developers, and not a single one belongs to an established franchise. The other nomination brackets reveal some interesting patterns of their own. There's a clear genre correlation with the main award. If you win the Game of the Year, you almost always win your genre category too. So if you're an action-adventure game, you can pretty much expect to also take Best Action-Adventure Game, and the same goes for RPG and Family Game if you're a platformer. The inverse is true for indies. If you win Best Independent Game, you're unlikely to also win Game of the Year. Then there are those genre awards themselves, which are almost entirely dominated by the same familiar names. Nintendo, for example, have won nearly every year they've been nominated in Sim Strategy, except for Advance Wars Reboot Camp. FIFA has been nominated in the combined sports racing category every single year without fail, but loses to titles with a single-player focus like Forza Horizon and Tony Hawk. And the fighting game category might as well have a flowchart. If there's a Mortal Kombat game that year, it wins, unless there's a Street Fighter, and if there's a Smash Bros, that wins instead. And in the years where it's not so clear-cut, they just give it to something like Multiverses, which then gets cancelled and somehow renominated the following year. But the most interesting trend I found while analysing the Game Awards is that what counts as a keenly baked game isn't as clear-cut as it was when the show began in 2014. The best example might be last year's winner, Team Asobi's Astrobot. Sure, he's a Sony-published, Sony-infused third-person adventurer where pressing X makes him jump. And yes, the little robot already won VR Game of the Year back in 2018, but otherwise he's unlike any previous winner. Rated Peggy 7 for cartoon violence and scary scenarios, Astrobot stands out in a lineup usually dominated by dark, mature blockbusters. There's barely any story to speak of. A few light cutscenes explain why Astro's on his mission, but there's no voice acting and almost no dialogue at all. In fact, the writing is so minimal it allowed for translation into 31 different languages, the most of any Game of the Year nominee or winner to date. And apart from nominee Balatro, it also came from the smallest development team of that year. According to Moby Games, around 514 people worked on the title, compared to that yearly average of around 1,500. And with that smaller, less risk-adverse scale has come a bit more diversity. As mentioned, Balatro was also nominated last year, and while it's single player, it's certainly not a third-person action-adventure. What's fascinating is that that isn't an anomaly. The average team size behind Game of the Year contenders has been shrinking year by year. We're still talking AAA production values, but more and more AA or indie-adjacent projects are starting to dominate the conversation. Granted, the size of games themselves keeps going up. 4K Assets has pushed the average AAA install size to around 75 gig. Fun fact though, the smallest nominee so far was Celeste in 2018, another game from a tiny team of just 63, with an install size clocking in at just 120 megabytes, big enough to fit on a zip disk. While it's easy to be cynical about the kind of games that get the spotlight at the Game Awards, especially in hindsight, there's also something encouraging buried in the data. Year after year, games are trending higher in their critical reception. You could chalk that up to a bit of scoreflation, sure, but it's also fair to say that games themselves are reaching a consistently higher level of quality. The continued refinement of engines like Unity and Unreal, along with better tools and wider support networks, has raised the overall floor for developers across the board. Of course, that doesn't entirely square with the reality of studios shutting down or funding for indie projects drying up. But analysing the Game Awards is a bit like studying a plane riddled with bullet holes. We only see the parts that made it home. The data reflects what's deemed Keeley-worthy, not necessarily the full state of the industry. Which brings us to the future of the Game Awards, and more specifically the very near future of its 2025 ceremony. I can't say for certain what'll make the cut, but I've got a pretty strong feeling about my current picks based on looking at the past 11 years of trends. Based on Metacritic and OpenCritic alone, 6 games stand out as likely contenders: Clair Obscur Expedition 33, Hollow Knight Silksong, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Split Fiction, Death Stranding 2, and Hades 2. A big year apparently for games with numbers at the end, fitting with the trend of sequels and franchise games dominating the nominations. 2 come from major publishers, and 2 are follow-ups to previous Game of the Year winners. Following the other data, there's a spread of PEGI 7 to 18, but nearly all are single-player, third-person, action-adventure adjacent titles, and believe it or not, 5 out of 6 still have Jump mapped to the A button. It's also a year dominated by the usual strongholds of game development, with 2 titles from Japanese studios, 2 from the English-speaking world, the US and Australia, and 1 from France, a country with a surprisingly large game scene thanks to publishers like Ubisoft, Focus and Atari. The strong pick is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. It's currently the highest rated game of the year, but it doesn't come from a known developer or established franchise, and if nominated it would mark Kepler's first game to break out of the indie space. It's also another outlier in production scale, with only 403 credited contributors. Not quite as lean as Silksong or Hades 2, but still a strong example of the trend towards smaller teams delivering prestige level work. It's the kind of underdog story that award ceremonies like this are built on, much like Astrobot last year or Baldur's Gate 3 in 2023, which came from a studio that had built its reputation on the cult Divinity Original Sin series. The only real factor working against Clair Obscur might be its limited language support, with just 6 options available. Being an 18 also doesn't quite track with the trending down of PEGI ages year on year, and while it's been celebrated as a return to classic RPGs, that would make it the 5th RPG to win an award, following hot on the heels of Baldur's Gate 3, which itself was hailed as a return to classic RPGs of a slightly different flavour. There's also a few potential wildcards in the mix. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is one of the year's other highly rated games, landing on par with Hades 2 and Donkey Kong Bonanza once user scores are factored in. It also fits neatly into that familiar action RPG 1500 credits AAA zone that the Game Awards tends to favour. On the indie side, I think there's room for Blueprints and Caves of Cud to break through, even if both only offer a single language option, likely a side effect of being self-published or operating with smaller localization resources. If things keep moving in the same direction through 2026 and beyond, we'll likely see more AA and indie experiences breaking into the Game of the Year conversation, especially if they continue pulling in high review scores. It feels like a natural correction to where we used to be, an era where prestige games with equally prestige-sized budgets dominated awards season, and while we'll probably celebrate these newer titles as fresh, bold experiences, the truth is that many of them will still feel pretty familiar. In genre, in franchise, and yes, in the fact that pressing A will probably still make your character jump. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does remind us how we ended up with a term like Oscar bait in the first place. Trends repeat, especially as the industry contracts and expands. It's always safer to bet on what already worked, even if that means flooding the market with more of the same. But Astrobot and nominees like Balatro suggest that the future of the Game Awards might be more varied than the classic Keeley bait formula. The existence of categories like Best AR VR Game shows that there's still interest in how we play games, while innovation in accessibility celebrates the push to make them more approachable for everyone. Still, if the ceremony really wants to move beyond being gaming's answer to the Oscars, it might need to spotlight the things that makes games games, the interactive wrinkles that film could never replicate. And hopefully that means categories a little more inspired than, say, Engine of the Year, Biggest install size, or best use of the A button. This was just a small peek into the data behind the Game Awards. If you like this kind of video, a bit different from the usual, let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll even dig even deeper next time. Otherwise, I'd love to hear your predictions. What do you think is taking home Game of the Year? Until next time, I'm James, and I'll see you all in the next upload.